Do you like shooters? Do you like aliens? Do you like flying? Do you like the future? Do you like shooting at aliens while flying? Well, I've got it. How about spinning around in circles while flying and shooting at aliens, huh? Yeah, okay, that last one was probably a bridge too far. But if you like the previous four things, and who doesn't, have I got a game for you. Forgotten Worlds. Not to be confused with the Forgotten Realms Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting, was originally an arcade game by Capcom released in July of 1988. And it's not just any arcade machine, it's notable as being the first game ever released on Capcom's venerable CPS-1 hardware. If you're not familiar with arcade hardware, major manufacturers of arcade machines tended to have a specific hardware board design and then would create multiple games around that common platform, not unlike creating different game cartridges or discs for the same console. Capcom, during its arcade heyday in the late 80s and 90s, would have three generations of the CPS hardware, with the first and second being the most famous, and the third mainly being used for various versions of Street Fighter III and a handful of other titles. The CPS-1 hardware is most notable for being the platform that brought us Final Fight and the first three versions of Street Fighter II, but also powered other titles you've probably heard of, like Ghouls and Ghosts, Strider, and 1941. But it all began with Forgotten Worlds. Not only was Forgotten Worlds the debut title on the then state-of-the-art arcade hardware, it also utilized an unusual control scheme. Forgotten Worlds isn't just an ordinary side-scrolling shooter. It features one or two players who can fly anywhere on the screen while it's scrolling, and at the same time, enemies can come from any direction to attack our heroes. And also, yes, technically, not every stage is side-scrolling. There are some diagonal elements, and the last stage is vertical, but the vast majority of the game is side-scrolling. Anyway, back to the controls. To deal with the enemies that can come from anywhere, you can shoot anywhere as well, or at least in 16 directions in the arcade version. This is accomplished not by a second joystick like in Robotron or Smash TV, or a rotating controller like in Heavy Barrel, but with a rotating fire button that orients the character in the direction that they want to fire, and then pressing the button fires in that direction. It's definitely not a normal setup, and I don't think I've seen it used in any other arcade machine. While Sega did well on their own in the arcades, when porting games to the Genesis, they knew they needed more variety than just their titles. And with the previously mentioned CPS-1 hardware, Capcom was going over in the arcades in a big way as well. Normally Sega, or anyone not named Nintendo, would work with the developer to get ports of their games onto their console, in this case, the brand new Genesis. However, there was just one problem, and you probably know what it is. In the late 80s, Nintendo was still king of the home console, and that was partially due to predatory trade practices with third-party developers that they would later get in trouble for. But at the time, if you wanted to make games for the NES, you could forget about making games for anyone deemed a Nintendo competitor. As a result, Capcom, for fear of angering Nintendo, didn't release a game on the Genesis until late '93, with the debut of Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. But what about Forgotten Worlds, or Strider, or Ghouls and Ghosts, or Mercs? Well, in all of those cases, Sega licensed the rights from Capcom and created all of those games themselves for the Genesis. So even though the games are based on Capcom originals, each of those four titles are actually first-party games made by Sega. How well did they do, at least with Forgotten Worlds? Well, let's take a look. I've got to be honest, before I started doing this review and playing the game, I didn't realize what condition this game was in. I bought it very early on when I started collecting a few years ago, just because it's not terribly common, and I remembered really liking it as a kid when it first came out, and I played it on my uncle's Genesis, long before I had one of my own. As such, I didn't look at it too closely as I was just excited to see it, or else I might have waited on it a bit to get a better looking copy. This is actually two games in a row that weren't in the best of shape. If you happen to see last week's video on Back to the Future 2 for the Master System, you know what I mean. Now, that game sucked, so I don't really care too much that it wasn't in perfect shape, but since this game is actually good, I think I'm going to have to keep an eye out for a better copy. Thankfully, it's not too expensive, so trading out at least won't cost an arm and a leg. Anyway, let's look at the box. I believe this is formerly a rental copy, which is part of why it's beat up in places. The front cover get a little close-up of that, is a little bit washed out, except for a portion in the middle of the center, right up here. It's like there might have been like a sticker or something that was protecting that part of the cover. Thankfully, you can't really tell unless you look close, and I've certainly seen far worse sun-bleached covers. If you notice, this is an original Genesis-style cover with the graphics going all the way to the edge of the box, and not the inset style. And, it's an old title, and it is being released in December of 1989 in the United States. The top of the inner corner is a bit rough, but not bad. Where the main issue is with this case is the lower part of the inner cover, right there, which on the front and on the back, especially there, you can see is pretty damaged. I can only guess that maybe it was sticking out at some point and got wet. The rest of the case is perfectly intact, including the hang tab. So that's nice. Now, it'll certainly protect the inner cover from getting any worse. I like this front cover a lot. It's pretty iconic and straight from the arcade machine. Definitely a great design. As I flip to the back, briefly, you can see that the side here is bleached too. This is supposed to be more of a gold color than it is, and this is actually kind of washed out. As you can see here, if you see how darker that is, that's the color it's supposed to be on the side. On the back, there is a bit of flavor text that I like. It does a good job of selling the game. And then also 3 good screenshots from the game, including an enlarged one of one of the more iconic bosses in the game. When I booted up Forgotten Worlds for the review, I vividly remembered this boss from playing the game 30 years ago, so definitely a great choice for a picture. Opening the case, you can see the cartridge is in decent shape. There's a little bit of tape residue up there I need to take off from the rental sticker. But the manual is definitely a bit worse for the wear. Let me see. Thankfully, it's really just the cover that's beat up. The inside of the manual is fine and not really damaged. It's a little bit worn, but I wouldn't call it damaged. The intro has a great write-up on the backstory of the game that sets everything up, and some concept art, making a little sense of the acid trip this game is, as my son so affectionately called it when he was watching me play. There's also some great info in here about different things that can be bought at the shop. Right here. A lot of different things that can be got at the shop. And info about each of the 7 levels in the game. Oh, I closed it too quickly. All the different levels that are back here. Complete with more screenshots. I'll be honest, most shooters like this aren't terribly deep, but the manual does a good job of making the game seem bigger than it is. Okay, now that's out of the way, let's forget about how rough this copy is on the outside and get to the meat of the game on the inside.
Just briefly, I'll touch on the plot of Forgotten Worlds, and the short version is, at some point in the future, Earth is attacked by lizard-like aliens and the planet is enslaved. However, somewhere hidden away is a small resistance, and by the time the 29th century rolls around, they've perfected 2 super soldiers named, well, technically not named, the Nameless Ones, who just happen to be big muscle-bound dudes with sunglasses and cool haircuts. Yeah. Anyway, it's the Nameless One's job to fight back against the aliens and attempt to free Earth. Yes, even though the name of the game is Forgotten Worlds, there is only one world being fought over, so don't get too hung up on that. The Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds weighs in at 4 megabits. Pretty small compared to the games that would come later on the Genesis, but for 1989, it was state-of-the-art for a cartridge on a home console. However, even with that 4 megabit size, not quite all the arcade version was able to be crammed in. From what I can tell, the Genesis version is missing 2 levels from the arcade version, what was originally level 6 and what was originally level 8. And honestly, it's not too surprising that they had to cut something, considering the limited amount of space on the cartridge they had to work with. There was also some small amount of speech from the nameless ones that ended up being cut as well, similar to what we saw with the conversion of Final Blow to James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing in episode 53, or the Master System version of Gauntlet in episode 41. But the speech wasn't great to begin with, and there's really not that much of a loss there, as the only point of it was to narrate the cutscenes that you get between the levels if you finish them quick enough. I actually like those cutscenes a good bit. And maybe cutscenes is a bit of an overstatement, as all that really happens is that a still drawing of the nameless ones is displayed, with text depicting their gung-ho conversations below, but it adds a bit of 80s low-budget sci-fi cheese to the proceedings. Think things that Arnold Schwarzenegger would say in Commando, and you're pretty close. The cutscenes give a nice bit of flair and emotion to the game, and break up the monotony of just shooting at things for 7 levels back to back. As you can imagine with my description of the plot from earlier, and my son's description of the game as an acid trip, the game is a bit weird. Certainly not the weirdest game I've ever played, but Capcom was definitely very imaginative when designing this game, and that goes for more than just the unique control scheme on the arcade cabinets. But over the course of the 7 levels that did make the Genesis version, you're going to be facing all kinds of different enemies, including 7 level bosses that share nothing in common with one another, and that even have different strengths and weaknesses, which allow for a bit of strategy when choosing what weapon loadouts you're going with in a level. More on that in a bit. The first 3 levels of the game have you primarily going up against a few different types of lizardmen enemies and various robots, all while navigating a massive ruined city. The next 2 levels have a distinct Egyptian theme, and look almost the same except for the backgrounds. Originally the 6th level in the arcade was also Egyptian themed as well, but featured a floating King Tut sarcophagus as a level boss. In these levels, things definitely get a bit weird, as there are flying ancient Egyptians with bows, floating heads that shoot lasers, balls of fire, and sections where it appears random body parts are falling from the sky. Yeah. Level 6 on the Genesis version instead features a more Asian theme, different from any other level. As you go through the level, there are various shrines that are passed in the background, and the enemies all appear to be flying martial artists, frogs, and dragons. The 8th level in the arcade continued that Asian theme, and finally the last level in both games is the same, a unique vertical scrolling level inside of a tower where the final boss resides, that features more unique enemies as the game shifts to more of a space theme, with most of the enemies consisting of flying ships and mounted batteries of guns. Essentially, the arcade machine can be considered 3 trilogies of levels, the first 3 which can represent America or Europe, the middle 3 for Egypt, and finally the last 3 for Japan, with each trilogy being one of the Forgotten Worlds. Although it would have been nice to have included the arcade levels 6 and 8 in the Genesis version, I understand why those were chosen to be cut, due to their similarity to the other levels that were left intact. To be clear, the game is pretty unique in its setting and presentation. While sure, there are plenty of other futuristic shooters out there, I can't think of any that also include such a varied reliance on different cultures' mythologies as well. Also, in regards to presentation, some games fall victim to getting repetitive due to reusing the same enemies over and over again, just coloring them differently, but that doesn't occur here. Other than possibly the similarities that exist in level 4 and 5, the game constantly feels like you're moving through the worlds from place to place and keeps the game fresh. And partially in defense of levels 4 and 5, both of those levels feature 2 branching paths. As you pass through the levels, you can choose which of those paths you take, either by going through an upper or lower gate. So if you like, you can mix it up a bit when playing to keep those things from getting stale in those levels. As far as graphics itself goes, for a 4 megabit cartridge, I think they're pretty great, especially for a 1989 release. Each level is colorful and varied. The action gets pretty hectic sometimes, and yet slowdown is minimal, at least in single-player mode. I didn't test 2-player mode. And I didn't notice flickering anywhere, even during the final level, when there can be an abundance of sprites on screen. All action on screen is smooth and quick. Are the graphics as good as the arcade version? No, of course not, but it's a very respectable effort, with the main difference being some small loss of detail, and simplified backgrounds. Along with the graphics being solid, the music and sound effects in game are pretty great too. The soundtracks for each level are all well composed and match the on-screen action well. I don't think I'll see anyone buying a vinyl release of the soundtrack anytime soon, but the music is still solid and doesn't take away from the game. The in-game sound effects are solid as well, a few that there are. Each weapon has a different sound effect to go with it, which makes sense as you wouldn't expect a fire-based weapon to sound like a laser-based weapon. As mentioned earlier, the speech to narrate the cutscene comments from the nameless ones was cut, and actually I'm okay with that, because in that instance I'd rather have no speech than crappy sounding speech that caused something else in the game to be cut to fit everything into 4 megabits. From a gameplay perspective, Sega did an admirable job of translating the arcade's unusual control scheme to the Genesis. Rather than the arcade's rotating shot button, Sega simply dedicated the A button to spinning your nameless wand counterclockwise, and C to spinning clockwise, while leaving B to shoot, if you didn't turn on auto shot in the options. Yes, you heard that right. In one of the greatest options in a side-scrolling shooter ever, there's literally an option in the menu that turns on auto rapid fire for your character as you float through the levels, so that you can concentrate on more important things, like making sure your character is pointing in the right direction, and avoiding the plethora of enemies on screen. The A and C spinning scheme isn't perfect, and frankly nothing would be except for a second analog stick, which the controllers didn't have in 1989, but it works well enough to make the game very playable, and NEC actually stole the idea when they released their version of Forgotten Worlds for the PC Engine Super CD, and released a special 3-button PC Engine controller to go with that game that enabled a similar control scheme. Beyond physical controls, the game has a pretty cool in-game progression system, which allows the players to choose how they want to play the game. As players progress through the game, they collect money called Zenny. Some is dropped from enemies, and some is just hidden naturally in the environment. During each level, and twice in the last level, shops pop up that you can enter to spend your money. The shops will sell things like health refills, health bar extenders, extra lives, and weapon power-ups. Certain items like the health refills and extra lives stack, meaning that the more times you buy them, the more expensive they get. Also, usually each shop has multiple weapon options for your satellite pod, allowing you to really strategically choose how much you're going to spend on weapons versus health items, and then also which weapons will be most useful for you in the game, as some enemies will be more susceptible to different types of weapons. You can't buy everything, so playing through the game a few times to see what really works for you is important. Also, I should point out that when I say you can buy extra lives, what I mean is just that. By default, if you're playing in single player, you only start the game with 1 life, lose that life, and it's game over, and there are no continues. It sounds harder than it is, but chances are you're going to need to buy at least a few. Playing the game in 2-player mode is more of a cakewalk, as the game features infinite continues, so as long as both players don't die at the same time, making it through the game is relatively easy. I'm not sure how I feel about that. On one hand, it does make it like standing in an arcade machine with a roll of quarters, but on the other hand, there probably should be at least an option to limit that for people that want more of a challenge. There are 2 difficulty levels that can be chosen, normal and hard, but in my experience, hard isn't that much more difficult, and if you've got infinite continues, who cares? All in all, I'm giving Forgotten Worlds on the Genesis 4 stars out of 5. While the game is relatively short, and experienced players can blast through the game in about 25 minutes, I really had a lot of fun playing it. I think the difficulty level for single player is solid, and the added strategy of what to buy when makes you think more than you probably would in your average shooter. Also, for what's close to a launch title in 1989, this really feels like an arcade title. I know it's not as good as the arcade version, but just to see the arcade version represented so well in a home console is an impressive achievement. If you like shooters and have a Genesis or Mega Drive, this has to be a must purchase, and I've got to tell you, it's been a breath of fresh air after the last 2 weeks of reviews.
And that was Forgotten Worlds. I definitely have to upgrade this copy, and doing this review really made me realize that. Also, it was nice to play this game again and have it be just as fun as it was 30 years ago. I know not all games I review for this channel are going to be like that. There's just been too many advancements over the years, and let's face it, I think a lot of gamers are spoiled with just how good even crappy games look and sound these days. If you've never played it, and don't have a retro system, It's also on Capcom Classics Collection Volume 1 for the Xbox and PlayStation 2, if that's easier for you to track down and play. Next week, tune in as I play another classic Genesis sports title and play another game from America's national pastime. Which game? Well, if you're familiar with the early days of the Genesis, you've probably heard of it. It's another title that I remember playing 30 or so years ago, and I vaguely seem to remember liking it, but honestly, this could turn into a situation where it's like Pat Riley basketball, and it's aged about as well as an Italian sub that's been left out in the sun. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.